Hello and welcome to India Career Center, the one-stop podcast for students, professionals, parents and guardians. In every episode, we will try to deal with a current topic that needs expert advice related to career guidance and career mentoring. Please welcome your host, Dr. S.P. Mishra, to the show. And happy listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Steve Joordens once again to our show. Professor has been on our show before on a different topic, but today we are talking about a topic which is of a lot of interest for variety of people. I mean, it is a subject which is cutting across a variety of specialization, so to speak. And Professor Steve Joordens, being a professor of psychology, I thought he can actually stick together all those variations, all those varieties together in this conversation and help us to understand about consciousness, about spirituality, and about religion, and how they are interconnected with each other or not connected with each other with the guidance of psychology. I mean, that's the whole idea of this conversation. So, Professor, thank you so much to be on our show for the second time. And this is a very interesting subject. I know during a lot of your lectures, I have noticed you talk about this subject at a length and at depth. So I thought we'll try to pick your mind from there. So over to you, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, I really look forward to it, SB, and thank you again for the invitation. It is really interesting. When I begin teaching psychology, one of the first things I talk about in my class is I ask my students the question of why it took us so long to study ourselves scientifically, because we studied the universe and the stars and everything else before we kind of looked at ourselves. And when you ask why, well, that's because for many, many years, we really considered ourselves different from the rest of the planet. Everything else was physical. Maybe we were partly physical. We can go to Rene Descartes' notion of dualism, but the notion was we always had a soul or something metaphysical to us. And of course, science is about understanding how the physical processes work. And so if we are spirits in the machine, spirits in a material world, then it didn't really make sense to study ourselves scientifically, because metaphysical things can behave in non-physical ways that you cannot capture with science. So to some extent, the birth of psychology is a story about us starting to question our metaphysicalness. Like, do we have this sort of metaphysical aspect to us? Or are we, in fact, also just sort of materialistic beings, very complex biological machines? And if we start to think maybe we are, then that part of the machinery we can study with science. And so as psychology was born, it was more and more people thinking about things like consciousness, but thinking about them in physical terms. In fact, one of the very first things we could talk about is the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. He started doing a form of psychology that was all about, it's called structuralism. It was taking the periodic table of elements, what they did in the physical sciences, where they think, everything is a combination of certain physical elements. He wanted to know, what were the elements of conscious experience? If we look at this subjective awareness, this consciousness we have in our minds, could we identify what that is built out of? What are the components? And he included things like sort of emotional arousal. Certain things make you feel, more excited or more relaxed. And so he was trying to find out, what are these components of conscious experience? And those were the very first experimental studies in psychology.
Fantastic. So, as far as we understand, I mean, the concepts of science obviously came much later, and prior to that, it was all about philosophy. I mean, and
Yeah.
the reason being, philosophy is primarily is the power of observation, power of being able to imagine things and postulate. And
Yes.
that led to really science coming and trying to prove those postulations. So
Yes.
in a way, psychology is also like a science which came from the thoughts of philosophy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often, when I talk about what's the difference between the two, philosophy is kind of the starting point for psychology, for at least the science of psychology. Philosophy is where we come up with the ideas, the theories, and then that leads us to predictions. And so where philosophy ends is usually with the argument. You know, it's usually two people saying, I think it works this way, no, I think it works this way, and they try to use rational thought and argument to decide who's right. In psychology, we say, no, we have to use data. We have to say, okay, SP thinks it happens this way. Steve thinks it happens this way. Can we find a place where they make a different prediction about what should happen in some new situation that we don't know? And if they do, if you predict one thing and I predict another, and then we can go look, now we can use the scientific method to really try to figure out which ideas are good ideas and which ideas are not. So psychology has really embraced that scientific approach to get to knowledge, whereas philosophy stays a little more, in the realm of logic, argument, and they complement each other so well because we need the theory to drive the science, and so those two just kind of work hand in glove together.
Okay, so now trying to understand about consciousness itself. So can
Mhm.
you take us through your understanding from the point of view of different philosophies? For example, the
Yes.
Eastern philosophies have different thought process about consciousness, and the Western philosophies have different thought process about it. So can we start from there and take it to what psychology thinks about?
Yeah, and that really was the background. As I say, when I talk about the birth of psychology, we're talking about 1890s, and we're talking about Germany. You know, a Western context is where psychology was born. And of course, before that, just as you're saying, the concept of consciousness has, I don't even know if we know, how long it's been around. We can certainly go to Rene Descartes and this notion of, I think, therefore I am, some sense of his own. But Rene Descartes is late in the game, right? For the Eastern philosophies and such, this notion of consciousness and connection to a sort of universal power force, something, has been around for a long time. I mean, even I know in some of the African traditions they have interesting ideas that when we pass away, we don't really pass away. Our consciousness still exists for a while, and it exists as long as others remember us. So theoretically, by this African notion, you can still sort of connect with your ancestors as long as you take the time to remember them and have rituals. You can kind of reconnect with them. But when people stop trying, when they forget that person, when everybody has forgotten that person, it's only then that the consciousness actually goes on to some other dimension. And so there's ideas like this where, we have the physical world we think about, but then we think there's something beyond that, and that conscious part of us is the part that connects to that. So that's the real metaphysical kind of notion. And of course, there's a bunch of different sub philosophies we could talk about. I really did kind of come into this picture with, it's almost the erosion of those ideas. Like when we talk about psychology, it's almost well, let me say it this way. Some people say if you see a really good illusionist, like a magician, somebody who can do these illusions, even think card tricks or something like that, if you see them do something and you don't know how they do it, then it's magic. And what we mean by that is it feels a certain way. It makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. You're like, wow, how did they do that? You're amazed. But when somebody explains how it's done, and now you know exactly the skill behind the illusion, it's still impressive. You can still watch it and go, wow, that's really impressive. But it's no longer magic. It doesn't make you feel like, oh, this is. And so the question is with us, if we come to understand ourselves more and understand the reasons why we do certain things and behave in certain ways, act in certain ways, will that be like learning how the magic is done? And in the process, will the magic disappear? Will we come to a point where we don't need a metaphysical kind of assumption? And really, that is sort of what's happened in psychology. So I'll be able to talk about consciousness from a cognitive psychology point of view, which all of those with a spiritual and religious connection will find really disappointing because it will remove, some of that essence that makes consciousness so magic for so many of us. But that is, and so let's just be really clear, because I can almost say this in a very short, succinct way. Within the cognitive psychology world, the notion is that our brains are constantly trying to develop habits that will allow us to get through life without much thought. Even imagine driving a car, and those of us who used to drive standard stick shift cars, you could drive through a complex area and never think about your driving. Everything would just be handled by habit. And so the claim is, well, what's consciousness for then? If we can develop these habits and do it. And there was really sort of two situations. One, where we're facing some new challenge where we don't have a habit yet. Say I come to visit you and you say, I want to teach you cricket. And I say, I've never played cricket. I don't know how. I don't even know how to hold the bat. I don't know how to stand. And so at the beginning, you're going to have to give me instructions, and I'm going to have to consciously control myself. I'm going to have to listen to what you say, think about it, mimic it, and do it. And so at first, for new behaviors, we do them consciously. We're usually not very good. We're pretty, whatever. But if we do it over and over and over, then that's the path to creating a habit. And that becomes a habit. And now a really good cricket player doesn't think about where the hands are and where their feet are. They just know how to play. So that's one of the things, to form new habits or to overcome bad habits. So if we have a habit now, let's say we have our cigarette break at lunch or something, and we say, we know this isn't good for our health, we want to change. This seems to be, in a cognitive perspective, where conscious forces have to come into play now. They have to take control. So it goes back to the Rene Descartes view, where we imagine the body is a very complex biological machine that is often just controlled by reflexes and habit and responses, but is occasionally controlled by these conscious processes, which we associate with the frontal lobes, and we connect with goals and strategies. And so if our goal at New Year's is to stop smoking, now that's a conscious goal. And now I have to use that to overcome my habit. I have to fight my habit every step of the way. And if I can do that well, then I can reform that habit, and it can become something more productive. So those are really the two, consciousness helps us learn new behaviors and to reshape bad habits. And that's the primary thing. See, that's very disappointing, I think, to a lot of spiritual people.
Yeah, but then what I remember is that from your classes, you talked about a concept called neuroplasticity.
Yes.
In a way, I'm trying to connect neuroplasticity to what you just mentioned or explained.
Yeah. Okay. So neuroplasticity, and let's do the classic example of that just to make everybody understand. We used to think that only very young brains sort of grew neurons or grew connections, and that at a certain point in our life it stopped. But we found out that that's not strictly true. And one of the most famous studies is called the London Cabby study. Apparently, when you go to London, England is apparently just a maze of roads, a very complex set of roads in the city. And if you want to become a cab driver there, you have to first pass a test that shows that you know all of the. I don't know if this is true anymore, by the way. Now that there's GPS, this could be all gone, but this was pre-GPS. And so they had to prove before they could get their license that they knew all the alleys and the most efficient way to go from one place to another place. And that meant they had to learn all of this stuff. And so a researcher looked at a bunch of their cabbies' brains before they started doing all this, what we call complex spatial learning. and then after. So after they'd spent literally about a year in most cases, sometimes on a little scooter, driving all around the city, trying to learn how it all went together. So they're doing this really complicated spatial processing. And what they found is that the hippocampus, that's a part of the brain that controls a lot of our ability to do spatial memory and such, it was actually enlarged as a function of this practice. Spending a year intensely trying to learn spatial things caused that part of your brain to become stronger, more dense. And so that's what we think of as neuroplasticity. We're actually changing the structure of the brain. Now, in their case, how much of this is consciously controlled? Is it because of the strategy they're trying to learn and they're literally going through and that's what's causing the neurogenesis? Or would it also happen if somebody was just experiencing that without the same strategy? I'm not sure there's an answer to that. So I'm in my head trying to connect as well. Do you need consciousness to show that sort of neuroplasticity? Is that the basis of learning through conscious experience? I'm not sure. There's studies that have directly looked at that. So that I'm going to have some homework after this podcast to go look up some studies.
Right. So now to move on, let's look at the next subject, which is about spirituality. And there is a difference between spirituality and religion.
Yes.
While religion is more ritualistic, and spiritualism is not really always ritualistic. Sometimes it
Yep.
could be, but it
Yep.
is at a more broader level about things to do. Right things to do rather. So,
Yeah.
can you explain from your point of view about spirituality?
Yeah, I mean, I always find my students always find this interesting because they'll hear me talk about a number of things through the course, and they always come to me and say, where are you? And am I a pure? Because I'll talk about the pure materialist, and so if we want to talk about spirituality, maybe we begin with the opposite, which is this notion of no, there is no metaphysical nature. Everything in the world is physically determined, including ourselves. And so that we call a materialistic view. And if you believe that, then, once we learn how all of our neurotransmitters work and all of our synapses work, that will be all there is to us. We'll see there's nothing else. So that's the materialistic view. A spiritualistic view suggests, and it depends how metaphysical you want to be or how you want to look at the term metaphysical. So let me give you another example I like to give my students to think about, where I say, imagine you're an ant on the planet Earth and you live in some, ant civilization. You might think you understand life pretty well. And yet there's this whole other life, which was at the level that we're living at, where we're actually sharing the planet, but an ant might never know that human beings exist and certainly wouldn't have any concept of houses or cars or, skyscrapers, because in its sort of existence, these other things, although they exist, are sort of beyond its ability to comprehend. And so might we be those ants? Might we be living in worlds where we feel like everything that we see, everything that we know is all there is? But in fact, there could be other whole layers of reality out there. And could we connect with those layers? Could the ant connect with a human in some way or some form? Potentially. And so I like that example just to say humans are so quick to become egocentric, to think, it's all about us, we're at the middle of everything, and our world is the only world that matters. And every now and then I think it's really good to kind of shake us out of that and say, no, there's probably a whole lot more to existence and to life than we realize. And so when you start to open yourself up to that, then you're opening yourself up to forces or influences beyond the ones that we routinely are comfortable talking about. And so that sort of gets you into the metaphysical. Now, for an ant, of course, the human world isn't really spiritual. Like, it's still a physical world. It's just one that's beyond its ability to comprehend. And so you can be in both ways, I think spirituality, where you can believe there are forces, there are things out there. I even think of Star Wars sometimes, use the Force, Luke, this idea that there's some sort of energy in the universe that you can connect with. And so maybe in some yoga traditions and other things, spirituality might be less about any sort of god or deity, and it might be more about an ability to connect yourself with your natural, your nature, your basic, through your breathing, through things like that. I consider that a form of spirituality as well. We know from some of the gurus their ability to control their breathing, their heart rate, and things that we would have considered impossible, but they show no, through time and effort and a ritualistic process, you can do things physically that we didn't think were possible. And so I think it's always important to have that world open up to us. And often, while religions can cause conflict and various things because of the dogmatic nature of them, spirituality doesn't tend to, right? Spirituality tends to be a good thing, a thing we lean into that gives us peace, that gives us humility sometimes, a sense of our place, and that our place is not as huge as whatever. And I think it's really important for us all to reflect on ourselves, on our lives, on the importance. And I think often spirituality is a way through rituals of spirituality. And again, I consider something like yoga a ritual, through those sorts of things that can bring our mind away from all of the day-to-day 9 to 5, all of the things that cram into our brain all the time, to be able to put those away and to kind of think bigger about what's important to you, what's important in life. I think that's, I associate those sorts of things with a spiritual mindset, and humility. I really, part of being spiritual is admitting that there's more to things than or understand. And I think that's a valuable thing for us all to do every now and then, to just step back and be humble.
So do you think with every advancement in technology and knowledge about us, about the universe, about new things, there is an increasing leniency or increasing dependence on spirituality rather than anything else? I mean, for
Well,
example, if you talk
yeah,
about AI, for example,
yeah,
we know that AI is actually growing leaps and bounds by the day, rather. And
yeah,
we don't even know what's going to happen maybe 1 year down the line with AI. So
that's
does
right.
that actually push us, all of us, to more towards a spiritual pursuit, to be humble, to accept that there are things which is beyond us?
Yeah, and I think and spirituality can take so many forms. So let me take a little bit of a twist. Just to, again, it's going to be frustrating because I'm a scientist and I'm going to take the psychology lens and apply it to something like spirituality. But often these terms of religion and spirituality, I think, have meaning and relevance outside of their usual context. So when we think of being spiritual, we think of someone who's spiritual as, yes, humble, but also friendly, respectful, considerate. The notion being that you get a sort of value of life, and if you start to realize that you're just one form and your neighbor's another, and you tend to be a little more civil, you tend to treat other life forms better. And so one example of that in psychology, to show the power of that, is something we call social connection. And I think this is where AI, I'm living in this interesting world where I'm trying to use technology, AI, to fight the negative impact of technology on us. So we're trying to use technology to make us more human. And because here's this one example that's very profound. So many young people now, their primary form of communication is text messaging. So they just send each other these text messages. When you do that, you have a lot of time to think about what you want to say. You have a lot of time to think about what that other person is saying to you when they write back. And in fact, a lot of our young people have developed this style of communication where they want that time. That in fact, they think they need that time. They really ruminate over every message. They think about it super deeply. And now when we push them to talk like you and I are, face to face, real time, they find that ridiculously stressful. levels of social anxiety are really, really high. The reliance on asynchronous communication has made synchronous communication scary for them. And so that is how we connect. And that is a spiritual, we know that the more close social connections you have, the healthier you are physically, the healthier you are mentally, and it is the one clear predictor of happiness. If you have 4 or 5 people in your life that you truly love and that truly love and care about you, that is the source of happiness. I think of that, we can talk about that in scientific terms and as social connection. But when you think about those humans that love you and that you love and that you can trust and would do anything for you, that's a spiritual connection, right? That trust, the words like trust we use. I think of that spiritually. The people who I trust are special. There's something in that connection that you feel that tells you that person makes you safer, that person makes you happier. And I think that is a spiritual force. And I think it's one that's um, depleted right now. I think so many of our young people are missing that spiritual force. And that's why we're seeing anxiety as high as it is. That's why we're seeing depression as high as it is. And so I think it's a scientific example of how a spiritual force like human connection is so critical to our happiness and our existence. And so, what some would say, is that spiritual or is that not? In my world, that is. It's something that we can't define really nicely physically, but we know it's powerful and very important to our mental well-being.
Professor, I know that you don't follow very strongly any religious practice, but you seem to have very balanced view of everything. I mean, you are a scientist yourself. At the same time, you have very deep thoughts, which are philosophical, which are spiritual, and all that. I mean,
Yep.
all that has developed over a period of time because of your upbringing or because of reading. How it actually developed for you?
Yeah, so I was raised in a Catholic home, went to church regularly on a weekly basis, and my parents had a rule. They were Dutch, they came from Holland. They had a rule that you had to go to church until you were 16, and then you could make your own decisions. And I had 3 older sisters. Every one of them, the day they turned 16, stopped going to church. And so I felt like, so I stayed longer because I felt it was important to my parents and it felt like it might be disappointing them. But I was also the person in church who would not cause trouble, but you would talk to the priest every now and then, and I would ask the priest things like, "Are there dogs in heaven?"
Oh
And
God.
he would say, "Oh, I don't know. Dogs are, it's about human spirits or whatever." And I said, "But dogs are the best thing. If there's no dogs in heaven, it can't be heaven, right? Heaven's got to be beautiful, so it has to have dogs." And so I was the kid that was like, "Oh my goodness, this guy comes up with all these crazy questions all the time." Um, but I do think, I did my the reason I drifted, I think, from any organized religion is, and it's something I already mentioned, I think we as humans, I started to feel like we want to humanize everything, including the spiritual. So instead of the spiritual being a sort of nebulous concept of natural energy or something or whatever, we had to make it a man. We had to literally create, a god. And I kind of think of it that way, that we created a god and that we created a dogma around it. When you look at a lot of the rules of religions, they had more to do with um, control and power often than they have to do with actual, religious devotion in a lot of cases. And of course, I would also sometimes see people who were religious by the book. They would go to the church, they would do the rituals, but they didn't seem like good people to me. And that was always a problem with me, where I thought, if there's a God and if there's a judgment, that judgment should be based on our actions and our deeds for what have we done for others. And so I was almost at the point of saying, I'm just going to assume there's not, but even if there is, I'm going to live the kind of life that I think would pass judgment. I want to be the kind of person that is bringing positive energy into the world, however that may they be. Teaching is fantastic for that. It allows you to feel like you're doing that regularly. But I think it is important. We all know when we've done something good. We all know there's a feeling we get when we've helped another human being or in some way positively contributed. We know when we're doing things that are not good. We can feel guilt, we can feel shame, etc. And so for me, those are telling us something about the right way to live, which suggests there is some spiritual element back there. So I struggle a little bit. It's easier for me to say what I don't believe in, but I don't want to say I'm a solid materialist, because that's a belief to me too. That's a like to say everything is just physical matter connecting. That's to me a very strong belief too, and I don't know if I believe in that one. And so I like to keep the door open and think about things and have discussions and quite honestly learn from my students, because my students come from every part of the globe, so multicultural in my classroom, and they have so many belief systems. And I love learning and finding out more about them. There's things I really, respect in Buddhism, for example, and all sorts of religious traditions. There's fantastic things in every religious tradition. And yeah, I think there's so much to learn. And perhaps the most important thing is the community. The thing I like about religion is that it brings people together and it connects them via the religion, but it gives them a common ground for saying, hey, we are all sort of part of a larger family. And that is a spiritual force that's very strong. That can really help a lot of people through a lot of difficult times. And so I admire all of those aspects of religion. Do I believe the dogma? That's where I get into a little bit of trouble. But do I see positives in it? Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you said you slowly drifted from the traditional Catholic traditions, but is there something which is a kind of a catalytic incident or a book or a person which might have actually triggered this movement to a non-believing the traditional dogmatic religious practice?
Ah, interesting. So I sometimes I think this wasn't part of my development, but I see there's this comedian in England. I'm gonna forget his name now. Who's an atheist, and he does comedic sort of things about but a lot of what he says were thoughts that I think I had as I went through. So for example, I saw some post or something. He said, imagine if we continue to believe in the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and if we had wars because my Santa Claus was different than your Santa Claus, wouldn't that be silly if we did that as adults? And of course, he's implying that this is what's going on in a lot of religious contexts where they're doing stuff. And so I would see things, but I think the biggest thing was the hint I suggested earlier when I saw people being religious for what felt like the wrong reason to me, to be part of that club, to kind of say, hey, I'm checking the boxes, I'm doing all of the things, but then to see them, maybe be nasty to another human being for no reason or whatnot. And I'm thinking, are you really listening to what's being said? Because I believe most of what's being said in all religions. I think Jesus, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, there's a bunch of great things he said. Muhammad, there's a bunch of great things. Almost every one of these people, every one of these traditions has so much positivity in it. But when you start to see the people who are just sort of hitchhiking and stuff, then you start to think, what is this really? Are they true believers? And here's an example I can give you. Here's another community I belong to, vegetarians. This is completely off topic seemingly, but when I meet with a bunch of vegetarians, who I'm meeting with are people who have sacrificed a part of something they enjoy. Just about every vegetarian enjoys the taste of meat. They don't leave meat because they find it disgusting or whatnot. They leave meat because of some spirit, some reason, some personal, it might be
Maybe a
ethics
higher
of
purpose,
ethics.
basically.
Yes, some higher purpose, and now they've gotten together and they live it. And when I see people live it, that impresses me. Whatever it may be, if they're truly saying, you know, I believe in those positive words and I am going to be a vessel. I'm going to not convince everybody to believe what I believe, but I'm going to literally live the kind of life that, you know, by this teaching would be considered right and appropriate. Every religion teaches good acts, you know, good positivity. There is a set of commandments, so to speak, associated with every religion that tend to be very positive ways of life. And so I respect religion. I respect the religious, and it just doesn't fit me quite so well. And yet I still do think there's more to life than what we see and feel.
So, from the psychology point of view, I'm reminded of a term which you used, cognitive dissonance. So,
Mm.
when you see people with different behavior and still trying to be religious, that's where probably that triggered your thoughts.
Yeah, so the idea of cognitive dissonance is, and it is, it's a when you start to understand it and look within yourself, you feel it. So the idea is we can hold at the same time very different views on things, and if we ever put those views side by side, we'd be like, oh, they don't fit together, and that can cause what we call dissonance, noise, so to speak, and so the mind has these approaches to try to reduce that noise when we find it. And the fun experiments that started this were there was a woman who predicted she would go into a trance, she would write things with her left hand. So this isn't quite spiritual, this is something kind of related, I guess. And she claimed that aliens were communicating with her and that she would write things with her hand that they would tell her. And what they told her, of course, is that the world was ending on a certain date. People should sell all their belongings, go to this place. A UFO was going to pick up some of them and save them. The rest of the planet was going to be wiped out. And there was a date. And she got a bunch of followers. And so the psychologist said, okay, I want to talk to these followers because I want to see what happens the day after. You know, once they've literally sold everything they own, completely bought into this view, and now the day passes, which it did, the world did not end, and now how do they hold these two things? You know, I really, really believed her, but that didn't happen. And they would find every excuse to continue to believe. Once they believed something strongly, so she would say things like, oh, the date was wrong or something, and they would all believe what she says, and they would continue to follow. And so there is this notion that, you know, once you believe something strongly, your brain will sort of make it very hard for you to entertain other things that clash, at least once you see the thing. And then the other scary thing with cognitive dissonance, of course, is sometimes we don't see it. Like you may know
Ah,
people where you say, you know, you could go into a McDonald's, for example, a McDonald's restaurant, and I could ask people, are you an animal lover? And a lot of them would say, yeah, I love animals. And you say, you know, you're eating one, right? Like, doesn't that? And so most people would never even, you know, look at that disconnect. They can simultaneously call themselves an animal lover and be supporting an industry that's you know, causing a lot of pain and suffering to animals. But until they see that connection, and then once they do see that connection, that's when they start to downplay one or the other. And so maybe they don't even, so we have a notion called willful ignorance, for example, where a lot of, I'm getting too much vegetarianism into this, but where a lot of meat eaters don't want to know how the meat is actually, you know, comes to their table. What's the process? They will say, no, I just don't want to know. Because if I knew, well, then I have this dissonance, right? And so the easiest way to stop the dissonance is just to not let that information get in the first place. And so we'll have something like willful ignorance to try to prevent that.
what is your how you got into becoming a vegetarian yourself?
I came to it through a book called The Philosopher and the Wolf, a book my stepdaughter gave me because it had a lot of philosophy in it, which I like. And it talked about a guy who raised a wolf, which is a really bad idea, a philosopher who raised a wolf. And so all this stuff ensues. But he talks a lot about consciousness, and he gets into the issue of animal consciousness and animal awareness. And as I read more and more of that book, as a scientist, the thing that was on my mind was animal research and this idea that we are willing to do things to animals for the sake of research, that if we did them to humans, we'd say, no, no, that's not ethical. You know, you cannot open their head and remove parts of their brain and see what that does or whatnot. And so I started to ask myself, what is that based on? Is it like, can we come back to soul? Is it that humans have a soul and animals do not have a soul? That's what Rene Descartes said. And that's, in fact, what started all of this animal research was Rene Descartes. But, you know, when you start to ask, what is it that we must possess that makes us worthy of ethical treatment, and no other animal possesses that, that got me thinking more and more, and I couldn't come up with an answer. I couldn't, like, even when it's self-awareness. So when we in psychology try to study things like consciousness, again, as you said at the beginning, consciousness is such a big term, means so much. We start by reducing it. And so one of the things we've reduced it to is self-awareness. Are you aware of yourself? And there's an interesting technique for studying that. It's called the mirror test or the rouge test. And literally, there's a bit of a story behind this, but I won't give you the whole story. But the idea is they would take animals, and when the animals were anesthetized, say for dental surgery or something, they would put a mark, maybe a mark here and maybe a mark here on their face. But these marks would be odorless, they would be tactileless. When the animal woke up again, you allow it to see its reflection in a mirror. So a lot of animals will react to their reflection in weird different ways. But if you try this with a chimpanzee, chimpanzees get used to mirrors. They start to interact with mirrors like they're tools. They'll do things like open their mouth so they can see inside their teeth and stuff. And when you do this mark thing with them, when they wake up and look in the mirror, they'll look in the mirror and you can count how often do they touch this versus this, which would be your sort of control. And what you see is they touch this a lot. They literally in there doing like, what the heck is on my face? Which implies they have a sense of my face, and this is on my face. And so versions of this mirror test have been done with the great apes. By the way, gorillas do not pass, which is interesting. They do not touch the thing, and there's some arguments why, but so many animals do. Birds, elephants, octopus, certainly a lot of the whale family, the dolphins, porpoises. There's so many animals that show evidence of some level of self-awareness, where you start to say, I don't know. Are we uniquely self-aware? The scientific data doesn't seem to suggest that. And yet scientists are willing to do something to animals that we wouldn't do to humans. So that's always been a sort of thing that I like to throw at students as a critical thinking exercise. You know, you're seeing the scientific community behave in this way, behaving as though there's a clear ethical distinction between humans and animals. What is it? What is the basis of that? Can we find anything that really makes that a rational way other than speciesism? You know, other than, well, we'll do it to them because they're not human. And that's the only reason. And so it's a good challenge. I like to throw that out there for all of you too, to kind of think about. That's the thing that got in my head. After that, I learned about there's good environmental reasons. Meat production produces some of the worst toxins in the environment, more than all forms of transportation combined, by the way. And there's also health reasons. Now, health reasons is a little trickier. Certain kinds of meat, like red meat, are clearly bad for your health. But when you get into fish, maybe some white meats, there's arguments that they're not necessarily bad for your health. But overall, there's those sort of three reasons: ethics, environment, and health. And when you find a vegetarian, it's usually one of those three that got them. For me, it was kind of all three. It just became more and more no-brainer as I learned more. And so, yeah, that brought me down that path.
Okay, so before we close for today, do you think the traditional religious practices will proliferate going forward in the world? Because the way I see it, more and more religious practices or rituals are kind of getting toned down. I mean, if you talk to a young boy or a girl,
Yeah.
not many are actually attracted towards religious practices or rituals.
Yeah.
It could be because of a lot of information which is available to them, and so on and so forth. So are we seeing a time where religious practices will actually be weakened to a large extent going forward?
Yeah, it's quite possibly. I mean, Putnam has that famous book Bowling Alone, where he started like several decades ago. But in the time of our parents, it was very common for adults to get together, not just in religious contexts, certainly in religious contexts, but also, playing card games together or going to these, like we have things called the Lions Club or the Elks Club. These were all these community groups were very powerful. And what Putnam noticed is that sometimes starting 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, people stopped going to these organizations. They stopped joining things. And so he calls it bowling alone, because there used to be bowling teams that, people would be part of a bowling team, and everybody was part of something for a while. And now more and more people are not part of anything. And it's part of that social connection problem. A lot of young people probably would find it stressful to go to a ceremony where they're surrounded by strangers. And really that's what religion can provide, is that community, but you have to feel connected to that community. And a lot of our young people have trouble feeling connected to anything. They have trouble connecting because you need to have that sort of social comfort, and so many of them lack it. So yeah, we're seeing, certainly in churches and religious groups, we're seeing less and less religiosity all the time. I think that could change. I'm not sure that this is a trajectory that's just going one way, but I think that's where we are now. I think we're generally becoming more and more isolated. So can AI help us? That's again the weird situation I'm in. But as a sort of, I don't know, thought provoker at the end of this, we're used to AI right now as something that just we start a sentence and it finishes it, so to speak. We give it a prompt and then it runs with the prompt. But what if we started giving AI goals? What if rather than waiting for us to ask it to do something, it was preloaded with certain goals, intentions, things it wanted to do. And it would behave sometimes on the basis of its own goals rather than goals that maybe the environment had given it. How close are we coming to the sense of human consciousness there in AI? Will we come to an AI that starts to mimic a human conscious versus habit kind of interaction? And will that be a good thing if we do? I don't know. We're living at a time when we're going to probably see the answers to these things playing out in just the years ahead. And for someone who studied consciousness for a long time, that's kind of fascinating. The Turing test has already been beat, but can we actually see a sort of autonomous, self-motivated AI? And what do we do with that if we create it?
That sounds a little scary, isn't it? I mean, if you allow a self-automated AI, I mean, of course, if it is good, it will do a lot of good things. But if it turns out to be bad, then we are in for big trouble.
Yep, we've been down this path before with nuclear weapons, where scientists have, put their head down and found stuff out, and then we have to deal with the consequences. I think we're here again.
Okay, one last thing. So, David Chalmers talks about the concept of hard problem of consciousness. So, what is your thought on that?
Well, I mean, it's really, so when you get to the hard problem, it's trying to, how do we want to dig into it? So often when psychology, a problem they ran into was what we call the homunculus problem, that when we would try to talk about consciousness, we would talk about things like working memory. So quick example, if I asked you, how tall could you reach sitting on a camel? That's probably a question that's never been asked you before, but you have information and you can figure it out. You could start to bring together, let me see, how tall is a camel? How tall am I? That part of your brain is what we call working memory, the part that puts all that together. And that's very much associated with consciousness. And so when we talk about that, we will talk about a central executive that is getting information from long-term memory. How tall is a camel? Getting information from your memories, how tall are you from whatever, and then putting this all together. But that central executive, people say, but hang on, you've just put a little man inside the brain of this person, and all you've done is kind of, so how can you ever get to the actual non-anthropomorphizing of consciousness? How can you get to, what is it actually, and what is it in physical form? By the way, we didn't talk about, some psychologists think it's just some psychologists think it's just an epiphenomenon, that the consciousness is real, but it does nothing. So you can start to try to figure out, well, what is it? But that's where we get to the hard problem. It's so easy to just bump it back a level, but to get at the actual details of, what is it? How does it work? And how does things play out? I don't know. I don't know if we'll get there. Although honestly, the things that AI can do now, I would never have seen coming. I would never have thought it would be as trivial, I'll say, for AI to do things like produce art, as it's able to do now. If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, no way, that's 50 years off, that's 100 years off. And so now that I see the dramatic advances, I wonder whether things like the hard problem of consciousness might be something that's tractable. We'll see.
Okay. Fantastic. I think with that note, we will end today's conversation. It is always a lovely pleasure to host you and to talk to you. You have so many stories and so many ideas about your subject, and of course, subjects which is beyond the psychology also. It's always fascinating to talk to you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much, SP. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. We sincerely wish you could take something from our conversation today and be able to apply it to your life in a positive way. We value your feedback. This can help us improve our future episodes. So share your thoughts to serve you better. If you want us to focus on a topic which you think is of importance, let us know. We will share our expertise in future episodes. So, see you soon with a new topic and help you in your career journey.